Hi, welcome to the Duty to Warn vidcast. I'm your host, John Gartner, and today we have Dr. Andrew Spitznas. He is a psychiatrist with 20 years of experience. He is also a very interesting person. He has a blog about the movies, Secular Cinephile, and he also he specializes in areas having to do with PTSD. He has an interest in refugees. He's actually going to be working with some refugees later in the year. The reason that we're speaking to him is on his blog. He recently wrote an article entitled "On the Necessity and Perils of Declaring Donald Trump Unfit for the Presidency." In the first line of your article, you mentioned that you signed our petition. Would you like to say what it was that impelled you to sign our petition?
Certainly. First off, in my 49 years on this planet, I feel like currently our democratic republic is in the greatest peril that I've seen. With Donald Trump in the White House, we have an inept, corrupt autocrat with fascist tendencies. In Congress, we have a Republican majority that only sporadically seems to have a backbone to stand up to him, and a Democratic minority that verges on powerlessness. So I see that we're falling into a one-party state. And with this situation, I've gone to Washington, D.C. for the Women's March. I've protested locally. I've written to my elected representatives, and there's been a temptation through this to have a feeling of impotency in the face of all of this. So I just want to use any capacities I have to speak out against Trump. And I guess most relevantly for our conversation, and as I wrote in my article, I'm utterly convinced as a psychiatrist that Donald Trump is psychologically unfit to be president.
Yeah, I'd like to talk to you more about that, because you do mention that in your article. I'd like to. Sorry, hang on one second. I just want to make sure that my microphone is working. Sorry about that.
Nope.
Okay, we're good. I apologize. I was getting some feedback there that it doesn't seem to be working. So you mentioned several diagnoses in your article. I'd actually like to speak about them. First of all, you refer to Donald Trump as a diseased human being. So as long as you've opened that door, let's talk about what that disease might be. One of the things that you mentioned, actually 3 diagnoses, and I think all of them I think are actually accurate, and so I do want to discuss them all in detail. One is delusional paranoia. Could you help us understand what the diagnostic criteria are for delusional paranoia, why you think Donald Trump fits, and what the dangers of that might be?
Absolutely. Well, I learned as a medical student that a delusion is a fixed false belief that someone possesses in an absence of objective evidence, and that they cannot be persuaded to the contrary. And we have seen with Donald Trump multiple times that he is paranoid and delusional. One example of this would be his Twitter allegation that President Obama was wiretapping him at the Trump Towers. Subsequently, we saw this with his allegations of massive voter fraud that caused him to lose the popular vote. And then even more recently, when he returned from Europe, his statements that the world is laughing at America has a very strong paranoid flavor to it. So I've seen this pervade across the campaign and into the present day.
Yeah, somebody put together a list of conspiracy theories endorsed by Donald Trump, and it's something like 70 or 80 conspiracy theories. And there's so many of them, we forget his past greatest hits. You know, we forget about Ted Cruz's father killing Kennedy, or Hillary Clinton, smothering Anthony Scalia with a pillow. Global warming being a hoax. Not only is Barack Obama a Muslim from Kenya, But very few people know that actually Obama had the director of vital records at Hawaii murdered in order to cover up the truth about his birth certificate. Little known conspiracy facts. So
absolutely, yeah, the hits keep on coming, as you put it. And how can one trust someone in the Oval Office to interpret the very real dangers and threats that are out there in the world and respond appropriately to them when he has shown a consistent, very strong paranoid streak, as you've described?
Yeah, and part of that paranoid streak, when you combine it with these other factors we're going to talk about, like antisocial, is this feeling that anybody who does not worship him, who impedes him or disagrees with him, is not just an opponent, but that they are evil, and
yes,
that they're in a conspiracy against him, and that they need to be destroyed.
Yes, yeah, his fascist labeling of the media, the lying media, as he calls them, as the enemy of the people.
Yeah.
And I believe it was Donald Jr. or Eric who tweeted recently that Democrats are not even human. So as you mentioned, there's this dehumanizing streak, and I have little doubt that Donald Jr., Eric, and Ivanka and Jared Kushner do not make their public statements without getting clearance from the man in the Oval Office.
And one of the things people have said about these delusional or these paranoid conspiracy theories, and this now is going to shade into the other thing we're going to talk about, is antisocial personality disorder, is to what extent are these just lies that he's telling to whip up the crowd or to give himself some advantage or distract? But one of the points that has been made about these conspiracy theories is in some cases he holds them even when they don't appear to give him any political advantage. And that's one of the arguments, that they're delusions. It's one thing for me to tell you a lie and say, look, I already paid you the money I owe you. What are you talking about? Okay, that's an obvious self-serving lie. It's another thing to say that, no, actually, I had 1,000 people at my graduation, and for you to, that's obviously not true, John. I mean, why would you say something like that? It suggests you're losing your mind.
Yes, even when Fox News can't find good things to say, that a Republican president is in trouble when they raise concerns about possible obstruction of justice on the basis of his tweets and his interviews. Yeah, oftentimes he seems to be his own worst enemy.
And that suggests then that these beliefs are not just simple lies, because if they were simple lies, they would serve the purpose of a simple lie, which is to deceive someone for your benefit.
Precisely. And that may segue into discussion of his antisocial personality disorder diagnosis, where one of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual traits that is part of the sociopath diagnosis is impulsivity, and this would be a prime example of that. Another great example are his 2 a.m. tweets, and even his policy, his overall policies are incoherent. Before he was president, he was opposed to being militarily involved in Syria. Now he's for it. He claimed as a presidential candidate that he was going to be the most pro-LGBT president we've ever had. We've seen that hasn't worked out too well. And most recently this week with the AHCA, which he lauded as a terrific bill out of the House, he now has said is mean. So there's this impulsivity that leads to incoherence. And that's only one of the traits that one sees with antisocial personality disorder.
Maybe you could mention some of the others.
Absolutely. If one follows the DSM-5, which I do as a psychiatrist, of course, a personality disorder is something that is pervasive across one's lifespan and in a multitude of settings. And the general overarching description for a sociopath is that they have a disregard for and a consistent violation of the rights of others.
Right.
And Then one goes down the trait list. There are 7 of them, and I see that Trump meets 6 of the 7 easily. I already mentioned impulsivity. Beyond that, at the top of the list is the failure to conform to societal norms, which leads to the engagement in unlawful behavior. Right. We've seen this with the Trump University scam during the campaign, his encouragement of Russian hacking, and now his use of the White House to further his business interests. Secondly, we talked about his deceitfulness, and again, we saw this when he was a businessman, when it would be laughable if he were a mere billionaire businessman, but that he was calling media outlets identifying himself as John Miller and John Barron.
What's so funny about that is that in the diagnostic criteria, it mentions using aliases. And I have to say, in my entire career, I've never had a patient use an alias. So it's always seemed to me, when I read that diagnostic criteria, I'd kind of say, like, well, that's not really the best example, because if you're going to use an example, you want it to be a more high-frequency example that the clinician could go, oh, yeah, my patient does that. But here we go. He's actually using an alias.
Yes, he makes it very easy for us. And I wrote in my article that this is not rocket science diagnosing. The example I use that I see all the time in my community mental health practice is you have a patient come in with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and as you talk with them, you're convinced that no, they probably have borderline personality disorder and they have some mood instability. By contrast, this is not tricky psychiatry. This is very, very flagrant.
Right. Well, maybe you could explain something about that, because a lot of people don't understand, well, how can we make a diagnosis from afar? And yet, when you look at these DSM criteria that are so operational and so behavioral, for example, with antisocial, lying, well, Politico says he lies every 3 minutes and 15 seconds. He's like the Guinness Book of World's Record holder for lying.
Yes, my favorite quote there, I don't know if you've read Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny. He's the historian of 20th century Europe, has written a masterful book about the Holocaust in particular. And in his little book that I would recommend to everybody, On Tyranny, he has this wonderful statement where he describes that Trump's correct assertions are so infrequent that they seem to be unintended oversights on the path to total fiction.
Right. Sometimes he tells the truth by accident and usually gets in trouble when he does that.
Exactly.
Right. Very good. So, and I always say to people, so I know that Trump lies. If I met with him for 30 minutes or 45 minutes and he lied to my face, would that really give me new information when I see him lie on television and on Twitter every single day of my life?
Right. And this is where I think his manipulation of the media and Twitter can potentially come back to bite him in the tuchus. This is not a secretive individual. Probably he is the most public figure that we've had in recent American history, with his media appearances, his tweets, his rallies that continue to this day despite his being president. So we have a plethora of data to draw from. I do agree that normally the American Psychiatric Association's Goldwater rule would be applicable. I think in normal circumstances, it would be inappropriate to make a diagnosis of or I should say a very likely diagnosis. I feel 95% confident with this diagnosis.
It's not the same as going on Oprah to talk about the latest celebrity.
Right. We're not talking about Leonardo DiCaprio, who, gets plenty of press, but really doesn't have a whole lot of long-term relevance for the future of our world, though I'm grateful for his work on global warming. But beyond that, this is a horse of a different color. This is someone who I think we have right to be fearful could, because of his impulsivity, get us into a war. This is someone whose racist statements and policies are daily endangering ethnic and religious minorities. So as your organization is called, Duty to Warn, I think that our duty to protect our public, just as it would be with an individual patient, where safety always supersedes other concerns. I think I feel an ethical obligation to speak out that is far greater than adherence to the Goldwater rule.
Well, thank you. I think that's very well put. And I want to cite some of the things you said in your article because they're so well put. You said, "Never in my 5 decades have I felt the same existential fear."
Yeah, no exaggeration there. I've been a political junkie for as long as I can remember. Even as, goodness gracious, I think a 7-year-old, I earned $1 from my family for reciting the presidents in reverse chronological order. So I've always been a history and political nerd, and normally it's relaxing to pull out a history text and read about events, but I do worry for the future of our country. I have 3 children, one who is in Army ROTC, and I worry greatly what kind of military situation you could step in because of Trump.
That's a very good point. So maybe you could say more about that, about your fears that he could start a war.
Well, we've seen that in a couple of instances already, with his rhetoric that escalates in regards to North Korea. Certainly, I'm concerned about their dictator attaining operational nukes, but the way he overstates things and exaggerates things. Worry that we could get into another, as Michael Moore put it about Iraq, a fictitious war. Of course, we see his irresponsibility in pulling out of the Paris agreements, and that again is a classic example of lie upon lie. I believe it was the Washington Post and even the delightful John Oliver, who took apart his speech giving the rationalizations for pulling out of that, and every statement is an outright fabrication. So I think we have worries both about physical safety, but the safety of our planet, and then of course his racist statements, how we've seen how they've led to murders of folks whose skin is not as pale as yours and mine, and this danger is not going away in the short term either.
Yeah. You also said you've never felt such peril that our country could become controlled by an unstable autocrat and degrade into fascism. What are the things about Donald Trump's psychology that you see as a psychiatrist that should make you see the early markings or danger signs, red flags that suggest that we could degenerate into fascism?
That's an interesting question. It's and I guess looking at things overall, the way he has used the rallies to incite a vocal, generally Caucasian minority, where he has overstepped the line and even urging violence. And this also speaks to his sociopathy, the irritability and aggression there, where even he made not so veiled comments that it would not be such a bad thing if some of the, quote, Second Amendment types took a crack at Hillary. So akin to, and obviously we're an order of magnitude or two away from Hitler right now, but this inciting to violence, and also his embrace of the military. He wanted tanks and missiles for the inauguration. We just and his use of scapegoats, the Mexican rapists and criminals who are stealing jobs, the Muslims, painting them with a broad brush as all extremists and trying to put out his travel bans. This is Fascism 101. We saw Hitler do this with Jews and gypsies and other minorities. I mentioned Timothy Snyder. There was another military historian, Thomas Ricks, who sees all sorts of warning signs in Trump's behavior. So, I've had to kind of pinch myself a number of times to see, am I overreacting? But when I see 20th century historians who are making these parallels, I mentioned the enemy of the people statement. That's Stalinism 101. Right. There are all these signs that of authoritarianism. We see also the company that he chooses, where he's alienating Angela Merkel, where he was rooting for Marine Le Pen to win in France, where he's praised Putin, of course, and he's praised Assad in Syria. This is a man who loves authoritarian tyrants, and that's also an extremely disturbing sign.
So even though we can say he's an order of magnitude different from Hitler, we can also say that he's on the Hitler spectrum, or that he's part of the diagnostic category that includes Hitler, like other authoritarian dictators, like a Stalin, like a Pol Pot, like a Putin.
Yes.
You would agree
yes.
with that?
I would agree with that completely. Even his efforts, and this may offend some, but even his the way he cozies up to religious Christian fundamentalists in our nation is something we've seen Putin do that with the Russian Orthodox Church to generate a homophobic agenda in Russia, and where LGBT individuals have become the scapegoats as part of a worldwide anti-Russia conspiracy. Obviously, we saw that with Hitler and the Jews, where he cozied up to the German Lutheran Church, the Austrian Catholic Church, and Polish Catholics, and got them to march in step with him.
Yes, I think it is very parallel, and I think the American evangelical church is going to have a lot to answer for.
Agree 100%. I'm grateful, and the Sunday Times had a very encouraging article that there is a vocal minority within the church. So I don't want to paint them with a broad brush, but overall, you're absolutely right.
This is I have friends who are part of that minority. I don't want to forget them. Thank you.
Yes, same here.
Actually, you mentioned one other diagnosis we didn't discuss, the early stages of dementia. Maybe a lot of people have been talking about that, worrying about it, his strange speech habits, his inability to complete a sentence without interrupting himself in a tangential way. Maybe you could say more about that from a mental status examination point of view.
Certainly, and you're right. We are not alone in saying that. I was so grateful that the PTSD expert Judith Herman came out and recommended some neuropsychological testing for Trump. I think that is entirely warranted. And I speak about this from a lot of clinical experience. It's no exaggeration to say that I've supervised and directly worked with thousands of individuals with various types of dementias, whether Alzheimer's or post-stroke, you name it. And I see many echoes of the symptoms I've seen in those sufferers.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, definitely. To take one example that we've already discussed, the paranoia is classic. We see an escalating tendency towards delusional thinking. I can't tell you how many sweet little old ladies would tell me that family members or nursing home staff were sneaking into their apartment at night and stealing their belongings or rearranging them. We also tend to see with dementia a tendency towards perseveration, saying the same thing over and over again. We see a diminishing vocabulary and a diminished substance to individual statements. And I think we see all of this in Trump's extemporaneous speaking. So far, he seems quite capable to read off a teleprompter, but when he goes away from the teleprompter, when you read the written transcripts of his speeches, they go into incoherence and irrelevance. And especially when we just had such an eloquent president in Obama. He was far from perfect, but this was a man who is a master of public speaking, whether it was teleprompted or extemporaneous. And looking at Trump, the contrast is horrifying.
Yeah, I mean, he could speak in paragraphs. We're not sure Trump can finish a sentence.
Yes, exactly.
There is a kind of emperor's new clothes quality, too, when, as you say, when some of the things he says are literally incoherent. I guess the extreme example was the Covfefe, kind of the culmination of that. But we kind of listen to a sentence that literally doesn't make sense, and we all just kind of, okay. It's another thing Trump said.
Right. And and certainly there is the danger of a death by 1,000 cuts, but on the other hand, there is a danger to be desensitized by all of this, because I get on my news feed and it's what nonsense has Trump stated or perpetrated today, and as I mentioned earlier, these are far from normal times, and I think this is where it behooves us as psychiatrists to pull out all the stops. The Goldwater rule is normally a great thing, but I think posterity is going to see the APA's doubling down on the Goldwater rule, not even just leaving it out there, but doubling down on it. I think this is going to be their moment of shame that is going to be on a par with their labeling of homosexuality as a psychiatric disorder.
I agree 100% with you. And as long as we're talking about the APA, what do you think their motivation is then for doubling down on Goldwater? What's your view?
Well, we know that the Goldwater rule got a start because mental health professionals said Barry Goldwater was bonkers. In hindsight, wouldn't it be nice to have a Goldwater now as opposed to a Trump? Yes, I would too. I would take a Mitt Romney or honestly even George W. Bush again. I would rather have someone that I see as relatively mentally fit as opposed to someone who is mentally unstable like Trump. But anyway, as far as the motivations of the APA, I'm certainly not privy to the machinations there, but knowing the context in which the Goldwater rule arose, I have to think there is a fear of litigation. And we know that Trump loves to sue people. So I think there is a financial concern. I think there is a fear of getting into the crosshairs of the extreme right in our country. But I don't feel so grandiose that I expect that I can change the APA's leadership policy, but I do want to toss out a personal plea to my fellow rank and file members. I think this is a incredible moment in our country's history, as we've talked about, where we are in a pre-fascist state right now. And I would just urge my fellow rank and file members to let personal conscience and obeying one's personal conscience overrule any deference to wrong-headed policies that are put forth by our professional organization.
Well, that's very well put, and actually I really appreciate your making that heartfelt request to your colleagues. I feel the same way. One way I've defined it is, if there was a bomb on a plane, what ethical principle would stop us from warning the passengers?
Right. Yes, and even the history of the duty to warn rule, the Tarasov event, where I can't quote chapter and verse, but I know it was a mental health professional who failed to warn an individual that a patient had homicidal intent towards, an imminent intent. And so the legal precedent came out of that, and I think we have a macro example of that right now, and I think we are in dereliction of duty if we don't use our hard-earned clinical expertise to speak out at this time.
Well, thank you. That's very well put, and I agree with you. And if the APA says, well, the Tarasov rule only applies to our own individual patients, but there is a broader principle of the preservation of life being the most important value. And if we can break confidentiality, which is a core ethical principle, as opposed to Goldwater, which is a cover your ass, don't get a lawsuit principle, not something that came down from Mount Sinai.
Then, you're putting it much more directly than I did, but I'm in agreement with you there.
But if we can do that to warn about one person, why would we, when the stakes are so much higher, when we're really talking about warning every person,
yes,
that clearly the burden, the ethical burden, I would think would be that many billion times stronger.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you another question in terms of this duty to warn that you're feeling, that you feel such strong conviction about. Are you worried that Donald Trump could get worse? And what would that look like? And what are the worst case scenarios that we are realistically worried about?
I think I've little doubt that things will get worse, and I try to look on the bright side of things, but especially as we see the investigation into Russian meddling with the election, and where, as I mentioned earlier, even Fox News in the past several days were struggling to find good things to say about their favorite individual. I think, again, with his paranoid tendencies and his impulsivity, I think the danger to overreact on his part, or what he may consider to be an appropriate reaction to all the forces conspired against him, could lead us down very dark places. I again, looking at the parallels to fascism, I will not be in the least surprised if we have a Reichstag moment arrive, where there is some horrific event, whether real or imagined, that Trump and Steve Bannon and company used to justify restricting personal liberties or expanding executive power. So I think it behooves all of us to stay completely vigilant.
Yeah, you mentioned the Russia investigation, and I think that's a very important point, which is that we know that he becomes aggressive and impulsive and attacks viciously when he's under any threat. He does that just at the suggestion he didn't have the biggest crowd size. What's it going to do with the suggestion that he's a criminal that needs to be removed from office? I mean,
that's exactly right. The stakes only get higher as he's threatened with criminal charges or removal from office. He's not going to go quietly.
That's what I'm afraid of, and this is someone who has no limits.
Yes. You and I have a moral compass. I'm not convinced that Donald Trump, as a sociopath, has a compass, that he moves by any other guide by his own perceived self-interest.
Yeah. I'm actually convinced, and I'm going to make the prediction here and see what you think. I think he is going to fire Mueller.
Well, the politicos who are much more savvy about politics than I am are making those predictions. So, again, hearkening back to the impulsivity that is part and parcel of being a sociopath, and we've seen that he will act against his own interest, even if he's being counseled not to do so. He couldn't help himself with the Comey firing, to admit that it was motivated by his digging into Russia. So I think you're absolutely right. I I think would be entirely consistent with what we've seen of his personality and behavior.
It would be totally in character. It would be completely out of character for him to not do that.
Yes, yes. And again, whether it is, well, I think the firing will come, but we've already seen an escalation in his tweets. He can put his unsecured device away for maybe 24 hours, but he can't help himself. He goes back to it and makes outrageous statements that can potentially land him in hot water.
Yeah. Well, I really want to thank you for the stand that you've taken. I know it is harder for a psychiatrist because you do have the APA breathing down your neck. And the Goldwater rule is in your ethical code. It's only endorsed by our leaders, but it's not actually in the code itself. So we're a little freer. So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit and wonder if you would be willing to speak at one of our October 14th Duty to Warn meetings. I know we're having one in Chattanooga. I have no idea how close that is to you.
Okay. Yeah, that's I'm in the far east part of Tennessee, so that's about 3.5 hours away. So that would be doable.
Okay, great.
I will. Let's communicate about that further. But okay. I'm game for it.
Good. Well, thank you. I'm very grateful to you for that, and I know you'll do a good job because you're a good speaker. So thank you very much for speaking with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Nice talking to you. Bye-bye.
Bye.